Hello, all. I'm Kylan Rice, Associate Editor of the Missouri Review, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Patricia Cave, Senior Publicity Manager at Knopf, who is here to speak with us today about Rachel Yoder's Nightbitch, focus of our inaugural Miller Conversations on Literary Publishing. Prior to her current role, Patricia worked in the publicity department at Doubleday and Flatiron Books. Patricia has over a decade worth of book publicity experience, including running campaigns for New York Times bestsellers Shrines of Gaiety by Kate Atkinson, Ninth House by Lee Bardugo, The Hazelwood and the Night Country by Melissa Albert, and Caraval, Legendary and Finale by Stephanie Garber. She lives in New York City with her dog Donut. Patricia, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, apologies if you already hear my dog Donut in the background, but fitting for the book we're talking about.
That's right. That's excellent. And we will get to Nightbitch eventually, but I'd like to start with a couple of more general questions about what it is that you do. And again, thank you so much for being here, being with us in this project that we're undertaking. Well, let's start at the beginning. How did you get where you are? What are the prerequisite experiences, qualifications, and the networks that one has to pursue, or even accidentally venture into, to rise to the level of your career that you've risen to?
I think accidentally venture into is the best way to possibly put it. I was interested in publishing throughout college. I knew that was kind of the career choice that I wanted to go after. And while I was in college, I did a number of internships with MIT Press, with an independent editing company, kind of just getting a taste for what it actually would be in publishing and what department I wanted to work at. But when I graduated, I found it really hard to get my foot in the door of actually connecting with a big publisher and getting a job. I felt like I sent out a million applications everywhere and just never heard back anything. I would be excited when I got even a rejection email in response. And so finally, I found an internship with a boutique publicity firm that had been started by two women that used to be in the publicity department of HarperCollins. And as you know, I out of college wanted to join a big publisher right away, but this was the place that, got back to me. And so it actually ended up being a really great experience. And I got to learn a lot because this boutique publicity firm, they only the only thing they work on is publicity. It's the tiniest piece of the pie. So you really get to see everything from start to finish of what the publicity of a campaign is going to look like. And so while I was there, I ended up having lunch with one of their former interns who now worked at Macmillan. And she had heard of a job at Macmillan with Flatiron Books and ended up referring me for that position. And that's how I got to Macmillan and actually started my career in big publishing.
Wow, that's so great. Could you describe some other earlier experiences or models that continue to influence like how you do your job? I mean, being in a boutique place focused exclusively on publicity must have been a real just a real education.
Yeah, I learned a lot there, especially I think there's no better place to learn about author relations, especially because, with a publisher, the author gets assigned a publicist usually. It's very rare that they choose who they're working with, as opposed to working with a boutique publicity firm, the author is hiring them to do the publicity for their book. So it's very specific. They know exactly what they expect and who they're working with. So it creates a different dynamic between author and publicist for sure, because it's so direct. And I think I learned a lot about how to interact with authors and how to manage expectations. For example, while I was at that publicity firm, there was an author who we delicately would refer to as high touch, needs a lot of attention, a lot of care. And it was great to be able to learn how, these women would handle someone like that. So in that situation, they were like, look, we know you have a lot of questions coming up. Let's set up a weekly call. So every time, Wednesday at this time, we're going to answer all of your questions at once. And doing things like that to kind of get out of having 5 calls from an author every day and just kind of getting in the way of work. So yeah, I learned definitely a lot being at that, kind of company.
Um, it seems like publishing, and maybe this is just true of many, many categories of work these days, but it feels like publishing is particularly kind of volatile, like at this point, and maybe even a bit in flux. When we've talked to editors in the past, they've mentioned that one of the ways that they cope with the difficulties of those roles is just because they love it so much that they couldn't see themselves doing anything else. And so, what is it that you love about being a publicist? What is it? What is it about that role in particular that keeps you going, even through the ups and downs of the literary market?
Yeah, I think there is no one who works in publishing that doesn't love books. Like that is why we're all here. And it does create a really nice environment that everyone is really passionate about what they do and actually cares. The product, and a book is a product that I feel like was something that I had to learn, but the product that we're all working together and trying to sell is actually something we're really passionate about. I know for me, one of the reasons that I ended up going the publicity route, originally I thought I wanted to be an editor, but one of the reasons I ended up going the publicity route was that I really loved being able to watch readers connect with authors directly, not just at book events, but also, through interviews or reviews. And when I first started, working in publishing and would try to explain to people what I do, I would say, when you read a good book and you want to talk about it to your friends, that's my job. I read a good book and I get to just go out and try to get other people interested in it as well. So that's really what keeps me motivated and going. And I will say it's definitely in flux, but I feel like for the 10 plus years I've been working in publishing, people have always asked me, oh, do people still read books? And, we're still here. We still do. So.
Oh, thank goodness! I think we could do with reading some more. But could you talk a little bit about gaining the kinds of skill sets? I mean, you've talked about kind of author relations so far, but what other kind of skill sets are there that may be unique to publicity, or also could possibly be a skill set that travels? What are the tools that you work with in order to do your job?
Yeah, I mean, the one I was just referencing, pitching. So, like trying to get other people interested in the books. I feel like that is a big skill set that I've learned over the years, how to, write a pitch email to media, but also how to target my pitches. So, when I'm trying to, sell a book to someone, I'm trying to make it as personal as possible. And I do find that that's a skill that, if I ever did leave publishing, I still would be able to use in other areas. Of course, like administration skills, definitely got a lot of those my first couple of years in publishing as intern and assistant for a long time. But also in my the early part of my career when I was going on really large book tours, working events, I gained so many skills there just from, being with the authors while they were traveling. I feel like I could go run a travel agency at this point. But also being with them at an event, making sure everything runs smoothly. And that's definitely like invaluable to me at this point.
That feels like a great opportunity to start talking about a publicity campaign, kind of from start to finish. Um, what has to be finished for a publicity campaign to really start? I mean, there's the timeline of a book getting accepted and then edited and published, but where in that timeline do you show up and start to do publicity for it?
Yeah, so the very, very beginning of the process is we have seasonal launch meetings where our editors will present to us the books on their list for that year. So they'll kind of run through and give us all a little pitch about the books that they have coming forth. Usually by that time, we have manuscripts for those books. So after those meetings, I'll, write down, oh, I really want to read X, Y, and Z. These ones pique my interest. Sometimes there aren't manuscripts at that point, and it's something they just bought or they're hustling to get ready. But that's really where things start for me because as said, I go look at the books that I really am interested in working on. I'll then to my boss request the titles that really stood out to me. And from there, they'll assign titles to us. They are very kind about trying to make sure you get as many as the books that you're dying to work on. But also, of course, there's sometimes you're like, oh, okay, I wonder why this is on my list. But that's where things begin for me. And that's usually about a year ahead. From there, once we have a manuscript, the big part of my job begins about 6 months out from a publication date. So that's when I usually will connect with the author and agent. We'll set up a call, sometimes an in-person meeting. These days, usually a Zoom, but that's when we'll connect and I'll kind of outline for them my goals for the book, where, I see this hitting. And the thing that I've kind of crafted over the years of my job is I'll also at that point ask the author, what is your like big 10 wish list? What are the things that would really be meaningful to you? And sometimes, the answer is, oh, I want to be on the New York Times bestseller list. But more often than not, there will be things that surprise me, like an author who's like, oh, my parents read the Boston Globe every day. That's my number one. If I could get a review or interview or some kind of coverage in the Boston Globe. So I use that kind of wish list to craft my campaign and to make sure that in addition to doing, pitching the places that I know will get attention, I'm also catering to what the author really sees as a successful campaign. So from there, I start sending out my pitch emails to what we call long lead media. So that's print magazines and newspapers, any national TV or radio shows, because they book a little bit further out. From there, I kind of work on a rolling basis. So as we get closer to the actual publication date, I'll continue to pitch those long lead media contacts and start making bookings, but I'll also begin reaching out to what we call short lead media contacts, which is going to be your weekly magazines, online sites, things that don't need as much of a lead time to book up their press. And then that's also the period about 3 to 4 months out is when we start looking at events, whether that's virtual or in person, and start reaching out to bookstores to see where they have interest and confirming those. And that brings us up to Pub Day, which is usually when I tell the authors, a lot of times with publicity, it'll feel like for them, there's a lot of silence. And then all of a sudden, everything is happening during that pub week. That is very intentional. With publicity, we try to make sure that all of our media hits kind of go at once so that someone is, reading that Boston Globe review, and then the next day they open People magazine and see a review. We want it to be something where you're seeing that book as much as possible once it's actually available to buy. And then that's, kind of the big picture of the process.
Yeah, it's very involved. Could you give us a couple of keys to like that you've noticed over the years to that help ensure like a successful campaign? What are some things that you absolutely need to get done in order for this to have the chance that you want it to?
So this question is so interesting because the answer is kind of ever changing. What used to be the magical secret sauce for a successful campaign 5 years ago is so different than what it is now. When I first entered publishing, a little over 10 years ago, if you had an author on NPR and a New York Times book review, you were golden. That would usually help secure, if you didn't make the New York Times bestseller list, at least really healthy sales. And since then, and since the media landscape has been changing so much over the past decade, there is not really a simple X, Y, and Z is going to make a success, which is why I personally have kind of started to morph what I see a successful campaign as. And again, that's somewhere where like that wish list that I ask authors for really helps out, because if to them, all they wanted is the New York Times bestseller list, that's not always something I can guarantee. Same with if they're like, oh, I want to be a Reese book club pick. And, we can pitch as hard as we can possibly go, but it's something we have really little control over. So I think that in the past couple of years, what I define as a successful campaign has changed a lot. And I think Nightbitch is kind of a perfect example of that. It was a book that came out during a really confusing period for book publicity. And I think that, I think of it as such a successful campaign. It's a title I'm really proud of and I think got to so many people, but, it wasn't a read with Jenna pick or, some of these other metrics that you would put as quote unquote success. So I think the answer to your question is kind of ever changing, unfortunately.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. As a follow-up to just the campaigns themselves, I'm curious about how they're budgeted. Like, I mean, what kinds of budgets are you working with? I mean, I know it probably depends, it varies book to book, but I am wondering, like, what does the money go into? Talking about it, the publicity campaign budget.
Yeah, so for publicity campaigns, the budget is primarily used for events and for travel. So that's something that's also been really interesting to watch. We used to kind of always say, the rule of thumb for when you have an author on tour is you kind of bank in your head like $1,000 per city, and that's going to cover their airfare or train there, their hotel, their meals, their kind of incidentals. And, even in the past, I'd say year or two, we now are shifting that to, okay, it actually might be like $2,000 per city when we're taking authors out these days, given, the different costs now to travel. So that we use the publicity budget almost predominantly for events, and how that gets chosen is not necessarily always up to us. Early on in that process, when we, request titles and we do get our assignments, that's when I'll relay to my boss, I think this book would do really great with a 4 to 6 city tour. Here's where I'm envisioning we go, the author's hometown. In the book, they write about St. Louis, so we've got to go there and can draw on that audience, and trying to kind of make an argument for where I think we'll have successful events and how many there should be. That then goes up the chain beyond my purview, to our publisher, who, ultimately has the final call say and what budgets we're going to get. But yeah, for publicity, the budget is all about book tours and travels, and that's where it goes totally.
It sounds like you actually do quite a bit of work with the authors then. And do you see that as a collaboration? Is it always I mean, I'm sure that, every author is going to be a little bit different, but what are some of the experiences that you've had that you've really cherished with working with authors? And feel free to talk about sometimes it works.
Yeah, so I'll say on the pros column, back when I was touring with authors a lot, I had so many great experiences. As said, I think for me, that's really where you get to see firsthand readers connecting with their authors, and it can be very emotional and special. I very early on in my career went on tour with Jenny Lawson, whose fan base is, she writes about her own mental health struggles and is very open. And so the people that show up to her events bring that same energy. And it's, I would go to an event with her and I think she would speak for maybe 30 minutes, maybe 45, but then it would be like 3 hours of people coming up to get their book signed. And often people would come up crying or having really emotional responses. And it is so special to see firsthand how touched people are by books and by getting to be with the author. So that's definitely a really great experience. And I also, over the years have developed really nice friendships with a lot of these authors. So traveling with them sometimes does get to feel like you're kind of traveling with a friend, which is great. Definitely not always the case. I won't gloss over. But yeah, so that's definitely a really special moment. I will say, in terms of kind of the con columns, there's, I do have a lot of sympathy that authors spend so much time writing this book and they put so much into it. And then it's kind of like they hand off their baby. And I think that handoff a lot of the times can be really difficult. So I definitely have had experiences with authors where they want to be a part of every step of the process. They want to see how I'm pitching the book. They'll ask to like read my pitches and go over it with a fine tooth comb. And that definitely can be challenging, especially because they're really close to that work. They want it to be described exactly how it is in their head. But what, when we write pitches and how I'm trying to sell a book to the media is usually going to be pretty different than how an author wants it to. When I'm sending a book to the media and I'm trying to pitch it to them, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I want this to be in their beach read column, or I want this to be in their gifts for dad. And that may not always necessarily be how an author wants their book to be, envisioned. So there can definitely be some struggles there when authors want to, they want to be the publicist and the editor and the marketer and the salesperson for their book. So
I think that gives us a little bit of an opportunity to talk about the differences between publicity, being a publicist, and being someone who's involved primarily with the marketing of the book. Now, I think it's probably easy for people to imagine that those things, have some degree of overlap, but I don't know that we know exactly what those degrees of overlap are, or where they are just very different, if parallel, kind of like modes for people who are working in publishing.
yeah, so my anecdote to describe publicity versus marketing is we're both trying to get the book into People magazine, but I'm trying to get a review and marketing's trying to get an ad placement. So marketing deals with money. They they get to have a budget and they're going after, social media and advertising and, banners and things like that. So they work directly with a lot of the same media outlets that we're working with, but in a really different way. And publicity and marketing do work together. For instance, if I'm setting up a book tour, I need to keep marketing in the loop because they're going to create a graphic with all the details of the book tour that we can then post on social media, that the author can post on social media. So we work with them a lot. And also there will be media outlets where if I arrange for an author to write a personal essay, the media outlet will then offer, instead of paying the author for that essay, to basically pay us in an advertisement for the book on their website. So there is kind of an overlap. Sometimes we do work with each other in these different ways to kind of make sure we're getting books into the right places and working with one another, but it is a really similar job at times. And often in my intro conversations with authors, I'll say to them, if you're ever not sure if something is for marketing or for publicity, just send it to both of us and we'll figure it out on our end, because it can be pretty complicated from that end.
I'm wondering if this falls into your realm then, because normally in the back matter of a book, you'll have several blurbs, either of authors of books that are similar or authors of stature, and sometimes even shorter blurbs on the front, on the cover. Is that your job to kind of to seek out those blurbs and to seek out later, of course, there'll be reviews in various magazines or journals, but is that you tracking down those other authors?
Thankfully not. Editorial usually handles that, which actually works really well because the editors, I always say the only person that knows a book like the author is the editor because they have such a hand in the creation of it. So editors are the one who pitch for blurbs. They'll reach out to authors, and a lot of times they'll reach out to authors that they've worked with in the past. So it'll kind of be this system of, you remember what it was like when your book was out there looking for blurbs. Would you give one to this new debut author who doesn't know anyone? So those come from editorial. The part of blurbs that we work with is I do often use, blurbs that the book will get in my pitches. So if I'm, pitching Nightbitch and I have a blurb from My Sister the Serial Killer, which is a similar book, and I'm pitching it to a media outlet or a contact that I know liked that book, I'm going to use that blurb in my pitch because it's going to be kind of a entryway into the door of me telling them, oh, you already like, another book by this author who's endorsing this one. So thankfully, I don't have to do the corralling of those blurbs, but they're definitely really helpful in the publicity process as well.
All right, well, yeah, let's use that as an opportunity to move into talking specifically about Nightbitch. So what was your experience like working as a publicist for that particular book? And feel free to say whatever you'd like. And eventually, of course, we'll get to the part where it's also during COVID. So
Yeah, I loved Nightbitch immediately. I remember that book being in our launch meeting and just being so excited, even hearing about it. And the read was thankfully even better. But I will say it was one of those books that I so instantly loved and also was like, how do you explain this book to someone? It's the one line pitch can be really confusing if you're like, well, a mom turns into a dog at night, and the different nuances happening there. So it was a book I loved immediately, but I knew it was going to be a bit complicated to try to translate what was so special about it. Thankfully, the cover that they ended on was really wonderful, and that helps a lot in publicity, especially when pitching a book, because I can't tell you how many books with plain white covers that I've had, and trying to get that into a magazine is pretty difficult. So that was a huge help. But yeah, I loved the book immediately. I knew I wanted to work on it. And yes, also knew that it was going to be a struggle to try to make it a success during that very weird time frame after COVID. We hit a really odd period in the publishing world in 2020 because everyone started reading like crazy. It was everyone locked in at home and people were ordering books nonstop, and it was amazing and so special to see. But it also meant that, my part of the job, the publicity, the getting people to go to events, the helping people connect to a book was 10 times harder and really different than it ever been before. I will say, I think specifically with Nightbitch, we saw such a focus in 2020 on the changes in parenting during that time and when everyone was at home. And I think a lot of people were losing their minds, not just parents, but that was a really great angle to try to get media attention that wasn't just, another headline about what a difficult time it was, but trying to find the silver lining of, you know, everyone is looking at parenting in a different way right now. And here's a book that is fictionalizing a lot of those things that people are feeling and can maybe even help people understand those feelings in a different way. So it was a really weird, chaotic storm. And I think it helped and hurt the campaign in a lot of ways.
I do. I recall it well, and it was a different time for parents for sure. I wonder, it seems like a fine line to walk in a moment like that, because you don't necessarily want to appear as though you're capitalizing on something that's just kind of terrifying the world and driving us into a kind of isolation that most of us were not very comfortable with. But at the same time, how do you meet the moment? I mean, and take advantage of it, not in a cynical way, but in the ways like, what are some specific kind of like publicity things that you designed or kind of set in motion that would kind of navigate that, first of all, just the weirdness of the pandemic, but also really kind of like supporting the book as something that could help us get through it.
Yeah, so this actually is not unique to COVID. There's been a number of different periods in my career where there is something going on nationally or globally that really changes the media landscape. We've feel like we've had a really wild past 5 years just in America. So this is not the only time something like that has happened. And I think as a publicist, that is a moment where you really have to be extra thoughtful about what you're doing. So I specifically for Nightbitch, I wanted to take this work of fiction and have it help people who were going through, really different struggles than they probably ever had before in their parenting. So what I had to look at was, okay, this is not going to be right now for a media outlet that is mainly giving us really hard, difficult news. I need to pivot this to outlets that are going to be trying to move away from that. So, for instance, Bustle had its kind of outshoot Romper, which was like the millennial parenting company. And that's perfect for something like this because they don't want to be reporting on, the hard, devastating topics. They want to be drawing away and be giving a different kind of view on what's going on. So with Nightbitch specifically, but in general, when there's a moment like that going on, we have to know that I'm not going to be hitting up CBS. I'm not going to be reaching out to them. I've had so many times in my career where I've had, author set up for a TV interview or radio interview, and then a big national crisis happens and they have to cancel that interview in a moment. So it's really about trying to reach out to the right outlets at times like that. And also, I will say a big help is the relationships that we have with our media contacts. I'm not pitching an email. I'm not pitching a faceless person. I'm reaching out to someone who I know and who I have a relationship with. So they know that when I'm saying, hey, I'm sure, your workload is crazy right now. Just wanted to make sure this book's on your radar, respond to me or don't. It's no pressure. They know where it's coming from. It's not a, mass pitch to 2,000 people who I've never spoken to before.
I imagine it takes a while to build up those contacts. This also leads me into a question that we have about the status of the book review. I'm curious to know from your perspective, like how the status of the book review has perhaps changed over the 10 years that you've been working in publicity. What role does it have? And I mean, it feels like a very important thing from the outside, but I'm curious to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, I personally think the impact of book reviews has been dwindling over the past few years. I mean, I know anecdotally, one of my favorite books of all time, my sister read a review for it in People magazine. My mom was reading it on the plane next to me and I stole it from her. And that's how it became one of our favorite books. And we would have never, it wasn't a bestseller. It wasn't a book that everyone was reading. It was a book that we saw this great People magazine review for, and then we all became obsessed with it. And that was now many, like over a decade ago that, that happened. And I think that is so rare these days, especially just with the landscape for print media, but media in general. We find that fewer and fewer people are actually reading those reviews, especially when you can see a 10-second TikTok review of a book. Those people are not necessarily going out to go buy the New York Times and read, this page-long review in print. So I think the impact of reviews has been really, really decreasing over the past few years, but it is still helpful in terms of what we call pull quotes. So the quotes that we're able to get from those reviews. We do put those on book jackets, as you mentioned, but I also, if I get a book that has a, great review in the Washington Post, even if no one reads it, I'm going to pull out a 1 or 2 sentence quote from there and try to use that to get the author an interview on NPR or the Today Show. So they still have an effect. I just think it's a really different one than they used to.
I see. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. How did this work specifically for Nightbitch? Was during the pandemic, was it different to try to get reviews, or since everybody was just reading, there was a kind of explosion of people going like, well, I'm going to order a bunch of books because I'm stuck at home. Was it more feasible just in that window of time to get more reviews?
Yeah, so it changed a lot over, I feel like during 2020 and 2021, honestly, there were really different phases. So as said, there were going to be periods where the media genuinely did not have the bandwidth to focus on book reviews because they were focusing on reporting, actual hard-hitting news. So that was a stint of its own. But as you said, there was also this kind of wave of everyone reading a ton. And so that was when all of a sudden, we would see all these roundups of, here's to read while you're stuck in home or things like that. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that I think review coverage was upped during that period, but there was a great period of everyone is reading and actually has time to go look at these reviews that they maybe would have not in the past. So I think a big difference in terms of media coverage was the interview process. For NPR interviews, we used to actually have people go into studio to record those face to face. And that changed a lot during this period. Thankfully, NPR switched to doing those predominantly over the phone. They have like their own app that they needed you to download and use. But the fact that we were able to change that was a huge difference. And honestly, a really big help. I've had authors in the past where we would book an interview like that, but I had them on tour in a different state or, in somewhere that it didn't make sense. So it was a help and a hinder in a lot of different ways.
It feels like that's kind of that's the rule of the pandemic era is, on the one hand, there's a lot of things we discover that can be made more efficient, or we can just we can more easily do things, and then it's taking away a lot of what we were used to. I am curious, as we've moved kind of out from the center of the pandemic, around which there's a lot of talk about how everything was going to change. And I think everything, of course, did for a while. But I wonder how much of your job, I mean, you kind of have a career around it. How much has that returned to some sort of pre-pandemic normal, or have certain things just kind of like stayed with the discoveries that we made during the pandemic?
So the area that it impacted the most for sure was events. I said, tours. I don't know if they will ever be what they were before 2020. I think that a lot of publishers used to be a lot more amenable to sending authors out on tours, even if that meant these events weren't huge successes. I've been to events where there's 6 people in the audience of three, and 3 of them are family. So it's not saying that before 2020 all book events had a huge crowd, but our willingness to send an author out was very different. And when we had to transition to virtual, the virtual events, there was a period where we did feel like people were logging on. And then we quickly found a period where people did not want to be on their computers after being on their computers all day at home. They wanted to try to get outside, even if they couldn't go be with other people, as opposed to sitting at their desk for another 2 hours and watching an author on Zoom. So book events changed a lot. And when we started to kind of do them again, it's been a really interesting period to watch. Initially we were doing outdoor events like for Nightbitch. Rachel really had a huge hand in setting up an outdoor event with Prairie Lights Bookstore in her hometown, and getting to still do that, even though it wasn't, probably the book launch event that she had envisioned when she wrote this book. So we did a lot of events outdoors. We did a lot of events with masks and different procedures. And I'd say that it's a new normal now. Where book tours are much, much smaller than they used to be. And turnout and sales and expectations for both of those things are very different. I now know that a lot of my authors, I really am not game to send them out on a tour unless I can do a ticketed event or an event where there's a book bundle. So everyone who shows up is definitely buying a book, because, we'll do author tours where I'll have 150 people show up to an event and sell 25 books, which at that point, again, there's a lot of benefits to an event that aren't sales. But if you're looking at it as this is a product, then you do have to take a step back and see, okay, what are we getting out of, spending $2,000 to send this author to this city and selling 25 books? So that's definitely the area it's changed the most, and I think is still changing a lot.
I wonder, one of the great things about Nightbitch, and as we had our event with Rachel here, just very recently, there seems to be a kind of cult following almost. I don't use that in a pejorative sense at all. But I mean, people really connected to this book. There was one person who had a question after the conversation had been conducted. And I asked her, I thanked her for a question after the event was over. And I said, "Oh, do you work around here?" And she said, "No." I had left work and drove straight here from St. Louis. You know, that's a 2-hour drive to get there. And she was very into it. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit what it was like to kind of see that develop, even though the events were different than they would have been in a non-pandemic era. Were you kind of like seeing this happen in real time? And if you were, like, how does that kind of affect the next part of your role as a publicist? Do you kind of, is there a way to kind of leverage that to reach even more readers?
Yeah, so I feel like the cult following of the book is usually something that we know is happening. I mean, for me, my sign is always when my mom will ask me if I've read a book, and I'm like, "Oh yes, I'm working on it." That's usually my first sign. But no, usually I feel like the cult following, when you get those feelings, it will be after publication. Because as said, a lot of my job is making sure that at that pub date, there's as much in the media and news as possible. But when it's 4 or 5 months after a book has published and I'm, getting a request from a media outlet for a copy of it, or we're, seeing an odd spike in sales for who knows what reason, that's usually when we have a tip off that there's something happening. And especially, marketing handles all of our social media and they'll see a surge there, especially, and looking at their data of, impressions on social media posts that we have about a book or something like that. But the way that it kind of works in the publicity realm is that when we start to see that uptick happening again, when I'm out of the blue getting requests for a book, that's usually when we can say, okay, is there enough of a surge right now that I can use this to try to go get actual media hits again? Can I get this author on a, morning talk show 6 months after the books come out? So it is really special to see that happen. And I definitely think it makes a really big difference in marketing. When we see a cult following like that happen, often that's when there will be discussions to, okay, should we go back to the marketing budget and add more now so that we can build on this cult following and run ads where we're seeing it happen. But I think the biggest way that it helps in the publicity realm is when we start to see that happen, that's when I'm going out and trying to get interviews again, because getting a review for a book months after is really, really difficult. But setting up an interview or even setting up an event, that's where we're able to make things happen.
And I would imagine that a similar thing happens when you learn that a book has been not only optioned, but actually being made into adapted into a screenplay and a movie.
Yes, yeah, and I can tell you, I've worked on a lot of books that have been optioned for movies and TV shows, and I can count on one hand how many of them I've actually gotten to see come to fruition. So it is super exciting when we actually see like a movie poster or trailer or something happening. But for on the publicity side, when we kind of see things starting to generate with a studio, we will usually work with them to align in media hits. So there's obviously, publicists for that studio where they want to have a piece and deadline and they have their own contacts there, but we'll work with them as well so that I can then, try to do out a new round of pitching to my media contacts with like, look, this was just announced in Variety. This movie is coming on, November 2024. Do you want an interview with the author before that happens? So yeah, it's an exciting thing. It's even more exciting when it actually becomes a movie or TV show.
Yeah, and you all of a sudden you're seeing stills of Amy Adams looking a little rough on the edges. But yeah, it must be so exciting. I think there's a few more questions that we have, and I think that you said something about this earlier, but and of course it's partially you're asking for the books that you represent, but I wonder a little bit if you could talk to us a little bit about what kinds of books you most enjoy, kind of like doing publicity for. Is there a genre per se, or which will lead into kind of another question that we have about the difference, if there is one, between upmarket fiction and literary fiction.
Yeah, so I definitely personally I love commercial fiction, so upmarket exactly like you're talking about. And mystery horror novels. I'm definitely a huge Stephen King fan. So those are personally what I love to read, and I think the a mystery is when I'm reading the fastest. Not necessarily that's always a good thing, but that's usually what I can't put down. So I love reading books like that, whether it's for work or for fun. But it is really different when I'm working on, mystery thriller as opposed to a literary fiction title. Not only just in the media outlets that I'm reaching out to, but also how I'm pitching the book. I'm not going to go and compare crime novel to Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl because no one will open that email. But it's a different process when I'm pitching those outlets and how I want to work with them and kind of what works for the different audiences. A literary fiction audience is going to really value a very thoughtful review in Poets and Writers. Whereas if I'm trying to, sell an Emily Henry Beach read, I don't necessarily think they're going to care about that review or that's where they're looking for it. I think they'd value a lot more to see Emily Henry on the Today Show talking about the book or books that she loves. So.
Would you say that, I mean, when we're talking about books as commodities, which we were mentioning kind of earlier, I know it's important, especially in your role, to understand and appreciate that. And I also enjoyed the way that you were talking about, well, it's because I love books, though. It's like it's not a craven enterprise. It's something that I truly feel like I'm giving to the world. Um, I wonder, I mean, I imagine that's always been the case, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you have developed as a publicist over time. Like what ways have you changed with respect to kind of the job that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've referenced this before. I think the biggest difference is my relationships now with not only the authors, but with media contacts, because I've been in the industry for as long as I have been, I've been able to form really great connections and friendships with a lot of these media outlets. And that's been such a huge help. So, one of my very good friends is the booker for Good Morning America. So when I'm working on a book, I'm not going to send her, a very formal, awkward pitch email. I'm going to write to her and, as I would someone who I know and I'm comfortable with and tell her what I love about the book and a little bit about the author. And it creates a really good environment that, because she is a friend, I have had her say before, this isn't for us. And, it's not an email anyone wants to get, but as a publicist, you're really grateful even when you get a no, because a lot of the times we pitch these books and hear nothing. So we, kind of have this saying, even a no is a yes, because it's showing that they at least are being thoughtful about what they're choosing. And it is helpful to go back to an author and be able to give them that feedback of, oh, they can't do this book because they did a really similar book last week and, they don't want to double up, as opposed to having the author feel like, oh, nobody cares or nobody's paying attention. So I think the biggest way that I've changed is having those relationships with my media contacts, and definitely with authors as well. I mean, I am still very, very close friends with my first best-selling author who I first went on a huge tour with. And I value that relationship a lot because she's a wonderful person. But also in the book industry, it's helpful to be able to go to her because she has such a different eye for what's going on than I ever will, and she has a lot of other author friends in this community. And so that's definitely, I think, the biggest way that I've changed over the past years as a publicist.
Excellent. Yes. I mean, I just love the fact that so much comes down to relationships, and that you can maintain meaningful relationships in these realms, even when the dedication of the kind of like the job that you have is making sure that something sells as well as it can. I am curious, and I think this will be the kind of final interview question, but you've been around for 10 years now. You've seen a lot happen, a lot change. And I'm wondering what you think about the future. Like, what are the technologies or I mean, I don't hesitate to ask a question about AI, but I'm curious about what things you see on the horizon for your role in particular, but also just publishing in general.
Yeah, so I will not pretend like I'm any AI expert at all. But I will say I think it's one of the things that I love about publicity. Like there's such a human element to it, as we were just saying with, these personal relationships you have, but also a robot could definitely write a pitch, but I'm not as confident that they can write a pitch for my friend Kate, who I know loves a beach read. It's one of those things that I think there's such a personal aspect to publicity that is so meaningful to me and is the thing that keeps me here, but also, it is those events that I get to go work. And when I get to be in person with someone who has a really incredible relationship with a book that they've read, and I get to help introduce them to that author and have an even different relationship with that book. So I'm definitely interested in the ways it's going to change what we do and how we do it. And I hope that there's going to be some benefits to that as well. But I feel very good about the department that I ended up choosing here, because I know that at the end of the day, AI is not going to be able to go on the train with my author and get them to an event and make sure they have a great event and room service is still open when they get back to their hotel. So I think that's yeah, I'm interested to see how the answer to that question changes over the next couple of years. But as of right now, I'm just really grateful for the human element of publicity.
Well, and we're very grateful for you for spending time with us today. Thank you so much, Tricia, and just we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Bye.
I'm Molly. I'll be a senior this fall at Mizzou.
Nice to meet you, Molly.
Nice to meet you. And my one question is, whenever you were trying to get Nightbitch out there, were there any struggles or what was the hardest part about that? Because I know it can be like the name is a little bit off guard, but
Oh my gosh, the name. The name was a struggle. And I did actually have media outlets that were like, we cannot, write anything with bitch in the title. So that was definitely a struggle. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest and hardest thing with Nightbitch was that, when you're working on a book like this, where there's so many satirical elements, how do you explain that to someone in a pitch? And there's so many things about this book that you kind of don't want to give away. So I think the biggest thing that helped was using other titles that I could compare it to and really focusing in on Rachel's voice. The voice in Nightbitch is so incredible and snarky and weird. And so it was really helpful to have books like, My Year of Rest and Relaxation or My Sister the Serial Killer, where you have these narrators that have a lot of that, kind of unlikability that I was able to focus on that in my pitch. But yeah, the title was definitely a hurdle.
thank you so much.
Thanks, Ollie.
Hi, I'm Haley, and I'm a senior here at Mizzou. I was just wondering what your initial reaction to Nightbitch was. Did you know it was going to be a hit? Did you know you were going to take it more in the serious side or the comical side when going about it?
So my initial reaction, that's so hard. I feel like I loved it so much. I didn't know if it was going to be taken seriously or if it was going to have more of that like commercial, like kind of punk feel to it. I think I got the answer for that when I saw the cover that they chose. The author and obviously editorial team really focus in on what covers they want and what they want it to say. And I think that was a huge help for me. So the cover is one answer, but also once I started actually hearing back from the media about it, even sometimes when they won't confirm if they're going to do a review or not, I'll get a response a lot of time from, media contacts being like, oh my gosh, I loved this, or what the hell was that ending? And so once I started getting responses like that, I think it helps me a lot for how to move forward and how to position it. But yeah, it's a book that you can take in a lot of different ways. So definitely hard to figure out which one to go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Haley.
Hi, I'm Kate and I'm a sophomore here. I was just wondering how you interact with social media, like if you talk to influencers on TikTok or Book Talk or anything.
So thankfully, social media predominantly works with our marketing team. I am absolutely a novice to book talk, though I had an intern who explained a lot of it to me, and I'm very grateful. But so I would say that we, in the publicity realm, while we're not setting up social media posts, I do try to keep an eye on it, because that is exactly like we were saying before, where you can kind of get a sense if a cult following is happening. Like, for instance, Dua Lipa loved the book A Little Life, which is definitely not something I would have ever predicted or been able to predict, but it ended up having this big following on social media, thankfully because of her and a lot of other really influential people. So it's somewhere that I look. And then, for instance, with that, Dua Lipa ended up doing an interview with that author later. And so we were able to set something like that up. So it's definitely a useful tool, but I think we're still kind of learning how to work with it in the publicity realm.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Devin. I'm going to be a senior here at Mizzou. And my question, trying to think how to word it, but I think it's going to be along the lines of if you have if you're pitching the publicity tour or where you want to go and stuff, do you ever see a lot of backlash from the author or any pushback? And if so, how do you work through that?
Yes, absolutely. The very first tour I ever planned, I actually got pushback from that author's agent because I had an event set up in New Orleans. And the agent was like, well, if you're going to be in New Orleans, there's this great bookstore in Baton Rouge. You should also go there, which as said, we have a publicity budget. So a lot of times we will get pushback in different ways. And one big way is authors or agents, or even sometimes editors, will want to add on more and more events. And for us, it's kind of, we have to put our foot down about, okay, well, we're not going to set up an event in New Orleans and Baton Rouge because they're not that far from each other. And we're going to be pulling from the audiences. So rather than having two events where there's 10 people, wouldn't it be better to have one event where there's 20? So that definitely comes up a lot. And it's a difficult conversation, especially I think it's the hardest when, I'll have an author who's like, I'll do anything for this book. I'll go to 20 cities. And it's not a fun conversation to have with them of saying, cool, well, I don't have the money to send you to 20 cities. But usually my kind of card that I pull out in a scenario like that is I'll ask the author how open they are to local events. And for instance, if I have an author in California and they're willing to drive, great, let's set you up in San Francisco and, also in LA and also in San Diego, and try to work with them that way. But that is a difficult problem that comes up often.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Eleni. I'm going to be a senior at Mizzou this year as well. And my question is, so when you're getting those no's and not getting responses from outlets and from locations, how do you keep staying motivated to keep sending those emails?
Ooh, how do I keep staying motivated? That's a good question. I mean, as said, I think it's that in a funny way, you have to kind of look at a no as a positive thing. While there's books I love, we actually, we don't edit the books, we don't write them. I really have no control over how good or bad or lovable a book actually is. So I always have to kind of look at it as my job is just making sure that I got their attention. I got them to actually look at it and consider it. And not everyone's going to love every book. Trust me, I've gotten bad book reviews where you're like, oh man, my job is just to get the book reviewed. I can't control if it's a good or bad review. So, very similar problem. But I think the way that I stay motivated in times like that is that my job is to just make sure they're considering it. Even if it's a no, it's still a yes to me because they were thoughtful about it. So it's just kind of trying to get creative of, okay, if this place is saying no to it, where can I go? What can I do? I'm going to have to think a little bit harder about trying to find an audience here.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Lainey.
Hi, I'm Nina. I'm also going to be a senior this year. I was just wondering what your take is on the current trends in the industry.
So interesting. So current trends in the industry, I'll say it's enjoyable to watch them. I also think as a reader, I pay a lot of attention to it. I used to treat the New York Times bestseller list as though it was like the highlight of my week. We in publishing, we get it a little early. We get it every Wednesday at usually around 5 o'clock. It gets sent to us, and I used to be waiting by my email to open that up and see what books were bestsellers that week, even if I didn't have any that were contending. Just because I always found it so interesting, like, what is the trend right now? What are people reading? We've watched waves of romance novels being on that list. We've watched waves of only seeing mystery thrillers and what girl is dead on what train. And so it's been really fun to watch those trends occur. And I think that the only thing I can pull from it is that I've watched, one breakout book, whether that be Gone Girl or Beach Read or Colleen Hoover, kind of bring with it a wave of other similar titles. And, those trends come and go, but I think the thing that always sticks out to me is what was the book that started that trend, and what's that author going to do next. But also it's fascinating. I mean, I love seeing kind of the different waves, and when friends will come to me and be like, oh my God, have you read Fourth Wing yet? And then I'll kind of be like, okay, what are other books that are going to be like Fourth Wing, and how can we use that information to pitch the ones that I have coming? But
some people around the office have suggested that maybe Nightbitch was the beginning of a trend, or at least contributed to a trend on like media surrounding motherhood and parenting. Do you think there's any merit to that?
Oh my gosh, I hope so. I'd love to take credit for that. I think it's a combination. I said, I think Nightbitch came out during a really special time because there was such a new focus on parenting in a way that I don't think people were talking about before. All of a sudden, and in the same way that, like, I had friends that were teachers, and all of a sudden we were all waking up and being like, oh, teaching's really hard, and thinking and looking at it in new ways. So why I'd love to say that Nightbitch was the starter of that. I think it was also just everyone was experiencing this really different moment and focusing on parenting and motherhood in a totally different way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Tricia, for that. I know the students really enjoy that. As part of our project is, after all, to kind of benefit them and to enhance their student success. So it was really a great opportunity for them to get to talk to you one-on-one.
Yeah, so, thank you. Those were such great questions. And now I get to leave with this lovely compliment that I started a movement.
Nice. Yeah, they're really smart. They're top-notch, these interns. But yes, and just I don't have anything else to say right now except to thank you again, and to say that we'll be in touch when things are set up and the actual digital pieces and the digital archive is being set up and stored, and we will make sure to let you know.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was so fun. It's really rare that I get to just, again, talk about a book that I love for an hour. So I appreciate you guys making time for me as well.
Our pleasure. Okay.
Thanks, Trisha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Are we good to, okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.